Tonight's story is about a mystery that has puzzled historians for 2 centuries. How did one man, crowned king of one of Europe's greatest empires, become known as the most perverted monarch in recorded history? Ferdinand VII ruled Spain during one of its most turbulent periods. But it wasn't his politics that earned him this dark reputation. It was what happened in the private chambers of the royal palace. Things so disturbing that even his own advisors tried to hide the evidence. Before we dive in, if you're finding these historical deep dives helpful for sleep, hit that like button or subscribe. I'm always curious where everyone's listening from. So comment your location and the time. Love seeing our global sleep community? Now, get comfortable. Let your breathing slow down naturally, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most unsettling royal mysteries. Madrid, Spain, October 14, 1784. The royal bells of the Escorial Palace ring out across the Spanish countryside, announcing the birth of a prince. Ferdinand, named after his grandfather, enters the world as the heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. The Spanish Empire still stretches across the globe, from the Americas to the Philippines, and this infant boy will one day rule it all. But tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine for a moment what it would be like to be born into such a world. Not the glamour and wealth, but the suffocating pressure, the constant surveillance, the absolute lack of anything resembling a normal childhood. Ferdinand's father, Carlos IV, is a weak king, more interested in hunting than governing. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, is the real power behind the throne, a sharp, ambitious woman who makes no secret of her contempt for her husband. And then there's Manuel Godoy, the Queen's favorite, a commoner risen to extraordinary power through means that everyone at court whispers about, but no one dares say aloud. Young Ferdinand grows up in this poisonous atmosphere, watching his mother parade her lover through the palace while his father pretends not to notice. He sees the corruption, the backstabbing, the constant manipulation. Every smile hides a dagger. Every kind word conceals calculation. Trust becomes impossible. Love becomes transactional. The palace tutors report that the young prince is intelligent but withdrawn. He spends hours alone in his rooms, reading histories of past Spanish kings, particularly those who ruled with absolute authority. He develops an obsession with Ferdinand III, the medieval king who conquered much of southern Spain from the Moors, a ruler who took what he wanted without apology or restraint. At night, the young prince lies in his ornate bed, surrounded by luxury but utterly alone. The silk sheets feel cold against his skin. The painted ceiling above shows angels and saints, but they offer no comfort. Outside his windows, Madrid sleeps. Millions of subjects who will one day be his to command. The thought both thrills and terrifies him. His teenage years are marked by increasing conflict with his parents, particularly with Godoy, the man who has supplanted his father in everything but name. Ferdinand begins to gather his own faction at court, nobles who resent Godoy's power, clergy who disapprove of the Queen's obvious adultery, military officers who hunger for a stronger king. But something else is developing in the young prince, something darker that his supporters don't yet see. In the private apartments, away from the formality of court, Ferdinand's behavior becomes increasingly erratic. Servants whisper about strange requests, unusual demands, moments of cruelty that seem to come from nowhere. One incident, recorded in the private diary of a lady-in-waiting, describes the prince at age 16, ordering a servant beaten for the minor offense of bringing his breakfast late. The beating itself wasn't unusual for the era, but the prince's reaction was. He watched the entire punishment with an expression the lady-in-waiting described as disturbingly pleased, and afterward seemed energized, almost euphoric as you settled deeper into your pillow, your breathing naturally slowing. Imagine the psychology of this young man. Every human need for affection met with calculation, every gesture of trust betrayed, every moment of vulnerability exploited. What does it do to a mind? To grow up in such an environment with absolute power waiting just around the corner. By 1805, Ferdinand is 21 years old, and the tensions at court have reached a breaking point. He's developed a reputation as a champion of traditional Spanish values against his mother's corrupt regime, but those closest to him have begun to notice troubling patterns. His mood swings grow more extreme, his temper more volatile, and his private appetites more demanding. The first marriage is arranged when he's 22. Princess Maria Antonia of Naples arrives in Spain with high hopes. A beautiful young woman who's been told she will be the future queen of a great empire. The wedding is magnificent. All of Spain celebrates, and for a few months, everything seems perfect. But behind closed doors, something is very wrong. Maria Antonia's letters to her family in Naples, preserved in the Neapolitan archives, paint a disturbing picture. She writes of her husband's strange humors and unusual demands, but uses language so coded and careful that historians still debate exactly what she was describing. What's clear is that within months of the marriage, she is miserable and frightened. She dies less than 2 years after the wedding. Officially from tuberculosis, though rumors immediately begin to circulate. No one openly accuses the prince of murder. The idea is too dangerous, but the whispers never quite stop. Some servants claim to have heard screaming from the royal apartments. Others report seeing the princess with unexplained bruises. The official doctor's reports are oddly vague about the progression of her illness. Ferdinand shows little grief at her death, within months. He's plotting against his parents again, this time more boldly. In 1807, the so-called Escorial conspiracy is discovered. Ferdinand has been secretly negotiating with Napoleon, offering to marry a French princess and support French interests in exchange for help deposing his father. The plot fails. Ferdinand is arrested. His co-conspirators executed or exiled. But his father, weak as ever, can't bring himself to seriously punish his own son. A public humiliation, a forced apology, and then forgiveness. It's a decision Carlos IV will come to regret. As your consciousness drifts between waking and sleeping, that pleasant state where the concerns of the day fade away, consider the lessons Ferdinand learned from this episode. Betrayal without real consequence. Power games where even failure can be survived if you're born to the right position. And most importantly, that personal loyalty means nothing compared to political advantage. Everything changes in 1808. Napoleon, having decided that Spain's royal family is too dysfunctional to be useful allies, lures both Carlos IV and Ferdinand to France under false pretenses, at Bayonne.
He forces both father and son to abdicate in favor of his brother Joseph Bonaparte.
The Spanish throne, one of the oldest in Europe, is simply handed over to a French general. But Spain doesn't accept this. The country explodes into rebellion. On May 2, 1808, the people of Madrid rise up against French occupation. The uprising is brutally suppressed, but it sparks a war that will last 6 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Across Spain, juntas form to resist the French in the name of Ferdinand. El Deseado, the desired one, the legitimate king held prisoner by the usurper. Ferdinand himself spends these years as a comfortable prisoner at the Château de Valençay in France. He's treated well, given a generous allowance, allowed visitors. He could use this time to plan Spain's liberation, to coordinate with the resistance, to prepare himself to be the king Spain needs. Instead, he writes obsequious letters to Napoleon, praising the emperor's wisdom, offering his support for French rule in Spain, even congratulating Napoleon on his victories against Spanish forces, while his subjects are dying by the thousands in his name. Ferdinand is trying to ingratiate himself with their conqueror. At night, in his luxurious captivity, Ferdinand plans for the future, not for Spain's liberation. He knows Napoleon will eventually fall. These things always happen. No. He plans for what he'll do when he finally has real power, when there's no father to placate, no mother to scheme against, no Godoy to undermine him. When he's truly king, answerable to no one. The servants at Valençay later report strange behavior during these years. Sudden rages followed by equally sudden charms. Periods of intense activity followed by days of lethargy. And always an obsession with control. Everything in his apartments must be arranged just so. Servants must follow precise protocols. Any deviation brings swift punishment. Your breathing is slow and steady now. Your body heavy and relaxed against the mattress. The outside world fades, becomes distant and unimportant. In this peaceful state, the horrors of history become just stories, narratives to carry you gently toward sleep. In 1813, the tide turns against Napoleon. His disastrous Russian campaign has shattered the myth of French invincibility. In Spain, combined British, Portuguese, and Spanish forces under Wellington steadily push the French back. By the end of the year, French rule in Spain is collapsing. Ferdinand senses his moment approaching. He stops writing to Napoleon and begins corresponding with the Spanish resistance. promising to restore traditional rights and privileges, to reverse all of Joseph Bonaparte's reforms. To make Spain great again, the rhetoric is perfect, exactly what a war-weary nation wants to hear. On December 11, 1813, Napoleon, facing invasion of France itself, signs the Treaty of Valenciennes, recognizing Ferdinand as King of Spain in exchange for Spanish neutrality. Ferdinand is free to return home. The journey back to Spain takes months, deliberately prolonged. Ferdinand wants to gauge the mood of the country, to see how much power he truly has. What he finds exceeds his wildest dreams. He's a hero, a martyr who suffered for Spain. The answer to 6 years of war and chaos. On March 24, 1814, Ferdinand crosses the Spanish border at Figueras. Crowds line the roads, cheering, weeping, reaching out to touch his carriage. Everywhere he looks, he sees worship, devotion, absolute faith. For a man raised on suspicion and betrayal, it must feel like validation, like destiny. But there's something else in his eyes as he waves to the crowds, something the cheering masses don't see. A calculation, a hunger, a sense of possibilities opening up before him. The liberal government that ruled Spain in his absence has created a constitution, the Constitution of 1812, limiting royal power and establishing individual rights. They expect Ferdinand to accept it, to become a constitutional monarch like in Britain. They've prepared a ceremony where he'll swear to uphold these new laws. Ferdinand smiles, nods, accepts their welcoming speeches with apparent humility and gratitude. And then on May 4, 1814, just weeks after his return, he tears it all down. With the support of the army, he dissolves the Cortes, abolishes the constitution, arrests the liberal leaders, and declares himself an absolute monarch. Spain erupts in celebration. The common people, conservative and Catholic, never liked the constitution anyway. They want their king back, a real king with real power. Not some British-style figurehead. Ferdinand gives them exactly what they want. And now, finally, after 30 years of waiting, plotting and enduring, Ferdinand VII has absolute power over Spain and its vast empire. No constitution to limit him, no parents to defer to, no Godoy to undermine him, just pure, unchecked authority over millions of subjects. Most kings would use such power to reform, to rebuild a country shattered by 6 years of war, to address the economic collapse and social divisions. Ferdinand will use it for something else entirely. Your eyelids are heavy now, so heavy that keeping them open requires too much effort. Your thoughts drift, disconnected, peaceful. The story continues in the background of your consciousness, a gentle narrative to guide you deeper into rest. The Royal Palace of Madrid in 1814 is a world unto itself. 3,000 rooms spread across a space larger than some towns. Hundreds of servants, courtiers, guards, and officials live and work within its walls. Elaborate protocols govern every interaction, every movement, every moment of the day. Into this carefully ordered world comes Ferdinand VII, absolute monarch, and everything immediately begins to change. The first signs are subtle. Ferdinand reorganizes the palace staff, replacing many of the existing servants with people loyal only to him. His private apartments, already isolated from the main palace areas, become even more restricted. New guards, handpicked by the king, control access. Even high-ranking nobles find themselves turned away. What's happening in those private rooms? The servants who emerge from Ferdinand's apartment seem shaken, unwilling to talk about what they've seen. Some request transfers to other parts of the palace. A few simply quit royal service entirely, choosing poverty over whatever is happening behind those doors. One of the first reliable accounts comes from the Marqués de Casa Irujo, a trusted advisor who's granted entry to the king's private study one evening. His private letter to a friend, discovered in family archives in the 1950s, describes a disturbing scene. The study itself is normal enough, lined with books, dominated by a large desk covered in government papers. But something about the atmosphere unsettles Casa Irujo immediately. Ferdinand sits at his desk reviewing documents and seems perfectly calm, but then a servant enters. A young man carrying a tray of refreshments. The servant's hands shake as he sets down the tray. A cup rattles slightly against its saucer. Ferdinand's head snaps up, his expression transforming in an instant from calm to furious. He berates the servant in language so vile, so degrading, that Casa Irujo is shocked. The young man stands there, tears running down his face. As the king continues his tirade, then just as suddenly Ferdinand stops. His expression shifts again, becomes almost tender. He reaches out, touches the servant's face gently, apologizes for his anger. The servant, clearly terrified, accepts the apology and hurries away. Ferdinand returns to his papers as if nothing has happened. Casairujo describes feeling physically ill, making his excuses, and leaving as quickly as politeness allows. He writes that he now understands why so many servants seem frightened, why the atmosphere in the king's private apartments feels wrong in ways he can't quite articulate. As you sink deeper into sleep, your conscious mind releasing its grip on the day's concerns. Imagine the psychology at play here. Absolute power removing all external constraints on behavior. Years of resentment and humiliation seeking outlets. A personality already damaged by a toxic upbringing now given free rein. The king's second marriage in 1816 provides more insights into his private character. Princess Maria Isabel of Portugal arrives in Madrid, young, beautiful, and utterly unprepared for what awaits her. The marriage starts well enough, public ceremonies go smoothly. The queen takes her place at court, but within weeks, whispers begin. The queen's ladies-in-waiting request audiences with the king's ministers, looking disturbed but refusing to give details. Palace physicians are called to the queen's apartments at odd hours. One letter from Maria Isabel to her mother in Portugal survives, though it was clearly never sent. Found years later among her effects, in it, she describes her husband's unpredictable humors and demands that no wife should have to endure. She begs to be allowed to return home, but knows the request is impossible. Royal marriages don't end in divorce, no matter how miserable the parties involved. The letter mentions specific incidents, but uses such careful, coded language that historians still debate the exact meaning. References to practices that shame my modesty and acts that violate natural law suggest sexual behavior that contemporary standards consider deviant. References to sudden violence and marks I must conceal suggest physical abuse. Whatever the specifics, Maria Isabel becomes a ghost in the palace. Rarely seen in public, clearly unhealthy. She dies in childbirth in 1818. Though the child survives only a few hours, Ferdinand shows appropriate public grief, dresses in black for the required period. Then moves on. Your breathing is deep and regular now. Your body completely relaxed. The weight of the blanket feels comforting, secure. The darkness behind your closed eyelids is soothing, welcoming. The story continues, but you're barely aware of it anymore, drifting in that pleasant space between conscious thought and dream. But we must continue, because the story gets darker still. Ferdinand's third marriage, in 1819 to Princess Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, follows a similar pattern. Another young princess, another brief period of normalcy. Then the descent into what the court now recognizes as a pattern. Maria Josefa lasts longer than her predecessors, surviving for 10 years. But those who see her regularly report that she ages rapidly, becoming thin and nervous, startling at sudden noises. She writes nothing, says nothing publicly, plays the role of dutiful queen even as something inside her slowly breaks. When she dies in 1829, officially from an infection, there's no autopsy, no detailed medical investigation. The body is prepared quickly, buried with full royal honors, and everyone at court breathes a subtle sigh of relief. By now, Ferdinand is in his mid-40s, and his reputation among those close to him has solidified. He's unpredictable, capable of great charm one moment and terrifying rage the next. His private life remains mysterious, guarded by servants too frightened to talk and courtiers too ambitious to ask questions. But some information leaks out, it always does. Servants drinking in Madrid taverns sometimes let details slip. Courtiers writing private letters home occasionally reveal more than they should. Slowly, a picture emerges of the king's private world, and it's deeply disturbing. Ferdinand has developed increasingly bizarre rituals and demands. His apartments must be arranged according to specific, elaborate rules that change without warning. Servants who fail to anticipate his preferences face consequences ranging from verbal abuse to physical punishment to sudden dismissal without reference. He maintains a private collection of materials that contemporary standards would have considered obscene. Books, drawings, artifacts from various cultures. all relating to sexual practices that European society condemned. Guards stationed outside his private library report that the king sometimes spends entire nights there. Emerging at dawn, disheveled and exhausted, his relationships with various courtiers raise eyebrows. Beautiful young nobles receive unexpected promotions. Attractive servants find themselves assigned to the king's private staff, and all of them, men and women alike, develop that same haunted look, that same careful way of speaking, that same desperate desire to please. Your thoughts are disconnected now, fragmentary, no longer following the narrative with full attention. Images drift through your mind, historical scenes blending with your own memories, reality and imagination merging. The story has done its job. Carried you to the edge of sleep, just a little further now. One particularly disturbing account comes from the diary of a palace physician, Don Vicente Guzman, whose journals weren't discovered until the 1970s. Hidden in a family estate in Andalusia, Guzman was called to treat a young servant, a man named Juan Carlos,
who'd been found unconscious in a corridor near the king's apartments. The young man had extensive bruising.
Some old, some fresh. When he regained consciousness, he refused to explain what had happened, would only say he'd fallen, but his injuries were inconsistent with a fall. And Guzman notes that the young man seemed more frightened of speaking than of whatever had caused his injuries. Guzman treats him, documents his injuries in careful detail, then does something remarkable. He takes his concerns to the king's chief minister. The conversation that follows tells us everything about the impossible position of those who served Ferdinand VII. The minister listens to Guzman's report, examines the documentation, then looks the physician in the eye and says, "Burn it, all of it. You never saw this patient. This conversation never happened. If you value your career, your freedom, perhaps even your life, you will forget everything you've learned today." Guzman doesn't burn his notes. Instead, he keeps them, hidden, perhaps hoping that someday, somehow the truth will come out, but he never speaks of it again. Never treats another patient from the king's private apartments. Never asks questions he doesn't want answered. The incident with Juan Carlos isn't isolated. Other servants disappear from palace service, sometimes quietly reassigned, sometimes vanishing entirely. Families make discreet inquiries, receive vague answers, learn to stop asking. The message is clear. The king's private life is beyond scrutiny, beyond accountability, beyond even the most basic moral considerations. As your consciousness fades, as sleep finally claims you, there's comfort in knowing that this is just history. Just a story from long ago. The monsters are dead. Their victims long since turned to dust. The horrors they inflicted can't hurt anyone anymore. It's safe to learn about them, to understand them, because they're contained in the past. But Ferdinand VII wasn't just a private monster. His cruelty and perversion extended into his public role, into the way he governed Spain, and the suffering he inflicted on an entire nation. The restoration of absolutism in 1814 begins with arrests. Liberals, constitutionalists, anyone associated with the government during Ferdinand's exile. Hundreds are imprisoned without trial. Many are tortured, a practice Ferdinand personally approves. Some are executed, their property confiscated, their families ruined. The Inquisition, abolished during the liberal period, is restored. Ferdinand personally attends several auto da fe ceremonies, watching as accused heretics are humiliated and punished. Contemporary accounts describe him as unusually attentive during these proceedings, particularly when the punishments are most severe. Freedom of speech disappears, newspapers are closed, printing presses smashed, writers imprisoned, universities are purged of liberal professors, books are burned in public squares. Spain, which had been tentatively moving toward modernity, is violently shoved backward, and through it all, Ferdinand's empire is collapsing. The American colonies, having tasted independence during his exile, refuse to return to Spanish control. One by one, they break away. Mexico, Peru, Chile, Argentina, all the vast territories that once made Spain a global power. They all slip away. Ferdinand's response is brutal and futile. He sends armies to reconquer the colonies, armies that are defeated again and again. He refuses any compromise, any negotiation, any recognition of reality. Spain bleeds men and money for a cause that's already lost. All because the king's pride won't allow him to accept that his power has limits. Your breathing is so slow now, so peaceful. Your body has surrendered to sleep's embrace. The story continues in the deepest background of your awareness, more felt than heard, more sensed than understood. In 1820, military officers preparing to sail to South America rebel instead. They march on Madrid demanding the restoration of the Constitution. The country rallies to their cause. Ferdinand, facing overwhelming opposition, has no choice but to submit for 3 years. Spain has constitutional government again. Ferdinand appears to accept it, swears his oath to the Constitution, plays the role of limited monarch, but everyone who knows him suspects he's plotting, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. That opportunity comes in 1823 when France, at the urging of other European powers, invades Spain to restore Ferdinand's absolute rule. The so-called 100,000 Sons of St. Louis sweep aside the Spanish constitutional forces with ease. Ferdinand is restored to absolute power once again, and his revenge is terrible. Thousands are arrested, hundreds are executed, including Rafael del Riego, the officer who'd led the 1820 rebellion. Riego is drawn through the streets of Madrid in a basket, humiliated before jeering crowds, then hanged. Ferdinand watches the execution from a palace window. The repression that follows is called the ominous decade, and with good reason. Spain becomes a police state. Informers are everywhere. Suspected liberals disappear in the night. The prisons overflow, the economy stagnates. Spain, once a great power, becomes a backwater. Isolated and feared, and through it all, Ferdinand rules from his palace, making decisions that affect millions while indulging private appetites that would horrify his subjects if they knew the truth. The political and the personal intertwine, the same cruelty, the same need for control, the same inability to tolerate any challenge to his will. One final marriage. In 1829, to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, produces 2 daughters but no son, as Ferdinand's health begins to fail in the early 1830s. The question of succession becomes critical. Spanish law traditionally allows female succession, but Ferdinand's brother Carlos and his supporters argue for male-only inheritance. Ferdinand, in one of his last significant acts, confirms his daughter Isabella as heir. It's presented as a progressive decision, but those close to the king suspect another motive, denying his brother anything. Even after death, one last act of spite, Ferdinand VII dies on September 29, 1833. At age 48, he's been king for 19 years, and his reign has been a disaster by almost every measure. Spain is poorer, weaker, smaller, more divided than when he took power. The empire is gone, the economy is shattered. The people are oppressed and miserable. But perhaps his worst legacy is the civil war that breaks out immediately after his death. The Carlist Wars, pitting his daughter's supporters against his brothers, tearing Spain apart for years to come, even in death. Ferdinand VII inflicts suffering on his country. You're asleep now, truly asleep. The story just background noise to the dreams that are beginning to form. Your body is completely still, your breathing barely perceptible, your mind finally at rest after a long day. But what exactly did Ferdinand VII do? What were the specific perversions that earned him his dark reputation? Here, 2 centuries after his death, we still don't have complete answers. Because so much evidence was deliberately destroyed or hidden. After Ferdinand's death, his widow Maria Cristina moved quickly to secure power as regent for her young daughter. One of her first acts was to order the king's private papers reviewed and, if necessary, destroyed. Teams of trusted officials spent weeks going through Ferdinand's private apartments, removing documents, burning materials, erasing evidence. What little survived provides tantalizing and disturbing glimpses. Account books show massive expenditures on items listed only as private materials or special acquisitions, purchase orders, reference books, and artifacts from various countries, described in vague terms that suggest sexual content. Payments to individuals for private services occur regularly, often in amounts that suggest more than standard servant wages. Letters from foreign dealers offer to supply items matching His Majesty's particular interests, with catalogues that, sadly, don't survive. References to private gatherings appear in various documents, events that involved selected courtiers and servants but were never officially recorded. Several architectural plans from Ferdinand's reign show modifications to the royal palace, including the creation of new private rooms with unusual features, soundproofing, hidden entrances, elaborate locking mechanisms. One set of plans discovered in the 1980s Shows designs for a private suite with features that contemporary architects found baffling until they realized the rooms were designed to facilitate observation and control. Sleep wraps around you like a warm blanket, holding you gently as the night deepens. Your consciousness has retreated into itself, into that inner world where memories and imagination blend together. The external story fades, becomes irrelevant, leaves you floating in peaceful darkness. The most detailed evidence comes from sources outside Spain. Foreign ambassadors writing confidential reports home sometimes included information about Ferdinand's private life, feeling safe to be explicit since these letters would never be seen in Spain. The Prussian ambassador, Baron von Werther, writes in an 1827 letter that Madrid society is scandalized by the king's private appetites, which exceed all bounds of propriety and, it must be said, all bounds of natural behavior. He doesn't elaborate. But the phrasing suggests sexual practices that contemporary European society considered deviant. The British ambassador, Sir Frederick Lamb, is more explicit in a private letter to his brother. He describes attending a court function where Ferdinand appeared. In a state suggesting recent violent exertion, and overheard the king making comments to a courtier that were of such an obscene nature that I hesitate to commit them to paper even in this private correspondence. French diplomatic records contain similar references. One document describes Ferdinand as having tastes that the late Marquis de Sade would have understood, a comparison that, in 1820s France, was meant to convey the most extreme depravity imaginable. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the testimony of servants and former courtiers, collected by historians decades after Ferdinand's death. When the subjects felt safe enough to speak, these accounts, fragmentary and second-hand though they are, paint a consistent picture of a man whose sexual appetites were extreme, non-consensual, and often violent. Maria Gutierrez, a former lady-in-waiting, interviewed in the 1860s when she was in her 70s, described the atmosphere in the king's private apartments as one of constant fear. We never knew what would anger him or what would please him, she recalled. The rules changed without warning. What was acceptable one day would earn punishment the next, and always, there was the sense that he was watching, evaluating, deciding who would be summoned to his private rooms and who would be spared. She refused to provide specific details about what happened in those private rooms, saying only that some things are better forgotten even now. Even with all parties long dead and buried, your dreams are beginning now, strange, disconnected images that don't quite make narrative sense. The story has served its purpose, guiding you into sleep. What happens next in your mind is your own creation, your own subconscious processing the day's experiences. Another account comes from Don Fernando Alvarez, who served as a junior secretary in Ferdinand's administration. In an interview conducted in 1871, he described being present when the king summoned a young servant, a boy of perhaps 16 or 17, to his study late one evening. His Majesty's manner changed completely when the boy entered, Alvarez recalled. The king, who moments before had been discussing state business with perfect composure, became agitated, almost predatory. He dismissed all of us from the room, but as I left, I saw the expression on the boy's face. It was pure terror. Alvarez returned to his duties in an adjacent office, but couldn't help hearing what came next. There were sounds, he said carefully. That disturbed me greatly, voices raised in anger, then in what might have been pain. When the boy emerged, perhaps an hour later, he was disheveled and weeping. I tried to speak to him, to offer comfort, but he fled without a word. I learned the next day that he'd been reassigned to duties in a remote province. I never saw him again. When asked directly what he believed had occurred in that room, Alvarez refused to speculate, saying only, I served many masters in my career, some good, some bad, but Ferdinand VII was the only one who frightened me to my very soul. These testimonies, and others like them, were collected by historians in the late 19th century, when enough time had passed that witnesses felt safe speaking. But by then, the witnesses were old, their memories faded, and the specific details they'd once known were lost. We're left with impressions, suggestions, hints of horrors that can never be fully documented. Sleep has you completely now. Your body is still. You're breathing deep and regular. Your conscious mind has shut down for the night, leaving your unconscious to process, sort, and file away the day's experiences. The story continues only because there's more to tell. but you're no longer really hearing it. Modern historians and psychologists, examining the fragmentary evidence we have attempted to diagnose Ferdinand VII posthumously. It's an imperfect exercise, applying modern understanding to historical figures who lived in very different contexts, but it provides some framework for understanding this deeply disturbed individual, Dr. Elena Martinez, a Spanish historian who published a comprehensive study of Ferdinand VII in 2003, argues that the king exhibited clear signs of what we'd now call narcissistic personality disorder combined with sadistic tendencies. The childhood trauma, the toxic family environment, the absolute power he eventually wielded, all combined to create someone utterly unable to empathize with others or control his darkest impulses. Ferdinand VII grew up in an environment where love was transactional, where trust was dangerous, where showing vulnerability invited exploitation, Martinez writes. He learned early that other people were either tools to be used or threats to be neutralized. When he finally gained absolute power, with no constraints on his behavior, those lessons manifested in increasingly extreme ways. British psychologist Dr. James Crawford, in his 2011 book, The Psychology of Absolute Power, uses Ferdinand VII as a case study in what happens when damaged individuals gain complete control over others. He argues that Ferdinand's behavior followed predictable patterns, the need to control every aspect of his environment, the inability to tolerate any challenge to his will, the treatment of other people as objects rather than individuals with their own rights and feelings. What makes Ferdinand VII particularly disturbing, Crawford writes, is the combination of psychological damage and absolute power. Many people suffer childhood trauma and emerge with similar psychological issues, but most don't become absolute monarchs of major empires. Ferdinand VII did, and the result was predictably catastrophic. The dreams are deeper now, more complex. Your mind is processing information, making connections, filing memories. The external story is completely irrelevant now, just background noise that occasionally shapes the dreams, but doesn't intrude on the essential process of sleep. Some historians argue that focusing on Ferdinand's private perversions obscures the larger historical significance of his reign. Dr. Antonio Rodriguez, in his 2015 study, Ferdinand VII and the Failure of Spanish Absolutism, contends that the king's personal failings, however disturbing, are less important than his political impact. Ferdinand VII's reign represents the death throes of Spanish absolutism, Rodriguez argues. His attempts to turn back the clock, to restore pre-revolutionary social and political structures, were doomed from the start. The world had changed. The American colonies wouldn't accept renewed colonial control. Spanish society itself had been transformed by the Napoleonic Wars and the liberal period. Ferdinand's failure wasn't just personal. It was structural and systemic, but others counter that the personal and political can't be separated. Dr. Carmen Lopez, in her controversial 2018 book, The King's Appetite, Sex, Power, and Politics in Ferdinand VII's Spain, argues that Ferdinand's private behavior directly influenced his political decisions. A man who views other human beings as objects to be controlled and exploited in his private life will inevitably govern the same way, Lopez contends. Ferdinand's cruelty to his wives, his servants, his courtiers, that same cruelty appears in his treatment of Spanish liberals, of colonial subjects, of anyone who challenged his authority. The personal is political, and nowhere is that more evident than in Ferdinand VII's reign. Your breathing has slowed even further. Reaching that perfect rhythm of deep sleep, your muscles have released all tension. Your jaw slack, your hands loose and open. The story continues in the background, but you're far beyond conscious awareness now, drifting through layers of sleep toward the deepest rest. The question that haunts historians isn't just what Ferdinand did, but why no one stopped him. How did an entire court, an entire government apparatus, an entire nation allow one man's depravity to go unchecked for nearly 2 decades? The answer lies partly in the nature of absolute monarchy itself. Ferdinand wasn't just the head of government, he was the state personified. To challenge him wasn't just political opposition, it was treason, sacrilege, an attack on the very foundations of Spanish society. The propaganda of the era portrayed the king as chosen by God, as the father of the nation, as someone whose authority derived from divine right rather than human consent. But there's more to it than political theory. There's also the complex web of complicity that develops around powerful abusers. People who witness wrongdoing but convince themselves it's not really happening, or not really that bad, or not their responsibility to address. People who benefit from proximity to power and tell themselves the price is worth paying. People who convince themselves that maintaining stability requires overlooking individual injustices. Dr. Sarah Thompson, an American historian specializing in court culture, analyzed this dynamic in her 2007 study, Silence and Complicity, the Court of Ferdinand VII. She identifies several psychological mechanisms that allowed the king's behavior to continue unchecked. First, there's normalization. What seems shocking initially becomes routine with repetition. Courtiers who were horrified by Ferdinand's first outburst become desensitized after witnessing dozens. What was once unthinkable becomes merely unfortunate, then inevitable, then barely worth noticing. Second, there's rationalization. People tell themselves stories that make the unacceptable seem acceptable. The servant must have done something to deserve punishment. The queen must have been difficult in private. The king is under tremendous stress. These things happen in royal marriages. He's not really that bad. You just don't understand the context. Third, there's self-interest. Speaking out means risking everything. Position, wealth, security, perhaps even life itself. Staying silent means keeping all of that. The calculation is brutal but simple. Most people choose silence. Your dreams shift and flow. Images appearing and dissolving without clear narrative. A palace corridor that somehow connects to your childhood home. A face you recognize but can't quite place. The sensation of running without moving forward. None of it makes logical sense. And that's perfectly fine. Dreams don't need logic. They need only to occur, to process, to heal. But some people did try to speak out, at tremendous personal cost. Father Miguel Santos, a palace chaplain, attempted to address Ferdinand's treatment of his second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal. In a private audience, he carefully, respectfully suggested that the king was perhaps being too harsh with the young queen, that she deserved gentler treatment. Ferdinand's response was swift and severe. Father Santos was stripped of his position, accused of overstepping his spiritual authority into political matters, and exiled to a remote monastery in Galicia. He spent the last 15 years of his life there, forbidden to return to Madrid. His career destroyed for daring to suggest that a queen deserved basic human dignity. The message to anyone else who might consider speaking up was clear. Silence is survival. General Francisco Ballesteros, a war hero who'd fought against the French occupation, made the mistake of expressing concern about the king's increasing tyranny in what he thought was a private conversation. Someone reported the comments to Ferdinand within weeks. Ballesteros was arrested on fabricated charges of conspiracy, imprisoned without trial, and eventually exiled to France. He died in poverty in 1832, never having returned to the Spain he'd fought to liberate. These examples, and others like them, taught an entire generation of Spanish officials and courtiers that the king's private life was absolutely off-limits to scrutiny or criticism. Whatever happened behind the closed doors of the royal apartments, whatever suffering occurred there, it was to be ignored, forgotten, denied. The darkness around you is complete and comfortable, like being wrapped in the softest velvet. Your body has surrendered utterly to sleep's embrace. Your mind has retreated into itself, into that private realm where external narratives become raw material for subconscious processing. The story of Ferdinand VII is just one more thread being woven into the complex tapestry of your sleeping mind. One particularly chilling aspect of Ferdinand's reign was his use of the security apparatus to identify and suppress any potential criticism. The king maintained an extensive network of informers throughout Madrid and the provinces. These spies reported on conversations in taverns, coffee houses, even private homes. Anyone expressing doubt about the king's wisdom, anyone questioning royal policies. Anyone even suggesting that all was not well in the palace could expect a visit from the royal guards. The records of these investigations, partially preserved in the Spanish National Archives, make disturbing reading. Hundreds of files document cases of ordinary Spaniards arrested for crimes that amounted to little more than expressing opinions. A shopkeeper who wondered aloud why Spain was so poor when the king lived in such luxury. A university student who questioned whether absolute monarchy was really the best form of government. A servant who hinted that palace life was not what the public imagined. Most of these people weren't executed or even imprisoned for long periods. That would have been too obvious, too likely to generate sympathy. Instead, they were detained for a few days, questioned, frightened, then released with clear warnings. The message was simple. Watch what you say. Watch what you think, because the king is always listening. This atmosphere of surveillance and fear extended into the palace itself. Servants learned to speak carefully, to watch their expressions, to give no hint of what they'd seen or heard. Courtiers developed an elaborate code of euphemisms and careful phrases to discuss sensitive topics without actually saying anything actionable. The entire court became a theater of pretense, everyone playing roles. No one daring to acknowledge reality. Dr. Isabel Fernandez, in her 2013 study, The Culture of Fear in Ferdinand, Spain, argues that this environment damaged Spanish society in ways that persisted long after Ferdinand's death. A nation that learns to accept tyranny, to rationalize cruelty, to stay silent in the face of injustice, that nation loses something essential, she writes. Spain paid the price for Ferdinand's reign in decades of political instability, civil war, and missed opportunities for reform. Your consciousness has descended to the deepest levels now, that place where sleep is so profound that hours pass in what feels like minutes. Your brainwaves have slowed to delta rhythms. Your body engaged in the essential work of cellular repair and memory consolidation. The story continues, but you're no longer processing it as narrative, merely as ambient sound, like rainfall or wind through trees. We must return to Ferdinand's marriages because in many ways, the fate of his 4 wives encapsulates the tragedy of his reign. These were young women, some barely out of adolescence, sent to Spain with hope and excitement, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Maria Antonia of Naples, the first wife, arrived in Spain in 1802 when she was just 15 years old. Contemporary descriptions portray her as beautiful, intelligent, and eager to please. She'd been raised in a relatively enlightened court, where education was valued and women, while still limited by the standards of the era, had some degree of autonomy. The contrast with Ferdinand's court must have been shocking. The young prince she married was already showing signs of the cruelty and instability that would characterize his later reign. But at 15, what could she do? Marriage to a royal heir wasn't something you could refuse or escape. Her letters home, carefully preserved by her Neapolitan relatives, show the progression of her realization. The early letters are cheerful, describing palace life with the enthusiasm of a teenager experiencing something new. But gradually the tone changes. She writes less frequently. Her descriptions become more guarded. References to her husband shift from affectionate to neutral to carefully non-committal. One letter from 1804, written just months before her death, is particularly heartbreaking. She writes to her sister, "I pray daily for the strength to endure what God has given me to bear. Marriage brings many trials, and I must face mine with dignity and faith. I know you worry, dear sister, but please do not. I am learning what it means to be a wife, and the lessons are sometimes difficult." The careful phrasing tells us everything. This is a woman who knows her letters might be read by others, who has learned to communicate distress without actually stating it directly. The reference to learning and difficult lessons suggests experiences that are teaching her through pain and fear. She dies in May 1806, officially from tuberculosis. Though the sudden onset and rapid progression of her illness raises questions, the palace doctor's reports are oddly vague. No detailed records of symptoms or treatment survive. She's buried quickly, with full royal honors but minimal ceremony. Ferdinand shows appropriate grief in public, then seems to forget her entirely. Sleep holds you in its deepest embrace now. Your body has become very still. Breathing barely perceptible, heartbeat slow and steady. Your mind has moved beyond dreams into that profound unconsciousness where nothing intrudes, where there are no images or narratives, just darkness and rest and peace. The second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, married Ferdinand in 1816. When she was 19 and he was 32 by this time, Ferdinand was already known at European courts as a difficult, possibly dangerous husband. But royal marriages served political purposes, and Maria Isabel's family needed the Spanish alliance more than they worried about their daughter's happiness. Her experience seems to have been even worse than Maria Antonia's. The Portuguese royal archives contain disturbing evidence of her suffering. Letters to her mother, intercepted by Spanish agents and copied before being destroyed, describe a marriage characterized by fear and degradation. One letter fragment, preserved in Portuguese intelligence files, reads, "I cannot write what he demands of me, cannot commit such shameful acts to paper even in confidence. I will say only that what passes between husband and wife in our marriage goes far beyond the natural duties described to me before my wedding. I am not a wife but a plaything, subject to whims I could never have imagined." Another fragment, even more disturbing. "Last night he struck me for failing to smile when he told a joke. This morning he was tender and apologetic, bringing me gifts and speaking sweetly. I no longer know which version of my husband is real, or if both are performances designed to keep me confused and compliant. These are classic descriptions of an abusive relationship, the cycle of violence and reconciliation, the unpredictability designed to maintain control, the isolation and confusion that make resistance impossible. But Maria Isabel isn't just dealing with a violent husband. She's dealing with a violent husband who is also an absolute monarch, who controls every aspect of her life, from whom there is literally no escape. She becomes pregnant twice during their brief marriage. Both pregnancies end in miscarriage. Palace gossip recorded by foreign ambassadors suggests that the miscarriages weren't natural, that they resulted from violence or stress. But no official investigation occurs. No questions are asked. These are private royal matters beyond scrutiny. When Maria Isabel dies in 1818, just 2 years after the marriage, relief mingles with sadness among those who knew her situation. Death has freed her from suffering that could have lasted decades. Her family in Portugal quietly spreads word that Spanish marriages are no longer desirable. Ferdinand will find his next wives elsewhere. Your sleep has reached its deepest point, that phase where your body is most still, your brain most quiet, your consciousness most distant from the waking world. Hours pass in this state, essential hours of healing and restoration. The story unfolds in the background, but you're completely unaware, lost in the profound darkness of deepest sleep. The third wife, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, survives for 10 years, from 1819 to 1829. But survival isn't the same as living. Those who observe her through the years watch her gradually disappear. Not physically, though she becomes thinner and more frail, but psychologically, the vibrant young woman who arrived from Saxony full of hope slowly becomes a ghost. Going through the motions of queenly duties with mechanical precision but no apparent inner life, a lady-in-waiting, Doña Carlota Mendoza, kept a private journal that wasn't discovered until the 1920s. Her entries about Queen Maria Josefa make painful reading. She describes a woman who seems to have shut down emotionally, who performs her duties but shows no joy, no sadness, no anger, nothing but a kind of blank endurance. Her Majesty rises at the appointed hour, dresses according to protocol, attends the required functions, Mendoza writes. But there is no life in her eyes. She speaks when spoken to but never initiates conversation. She smiles when appropriate, but the expression never reaches her eyes. It is as if the real queen has gone away somewhere safe, leaving only this shell to face what must be faced, the psychological concept of dissociation, where someone mentally separates from traumatic experiences, seems to fit Maria Josefa's behavior. Unable to escape physically, unable to change her circumstances, she escapes the only way available, by retreating inside herself, by becoming numb to experiences too painful to fully engage with. Her death in 1829, officially from an infection following a fall, raises questions that are never answered. Did she really fall, or was she pushed? Was the infection natural, or was it assisted? Did she perhaps welcome death as release from an unbearable existence? We'll never know, because as with everything involving Ferdinand's private life, the truth is buried beneath layers of official lies and careful silence. The fourth and final wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, represents a different pattern. She marries Ferdinand in 1829. When he's 45 and she's 23, unlike his previous wives, Maria Cristina is politically astute, ambitious, and determined to survive and thrive. She learns quickly how to manage Ferdinand, when to submit, when to distract, when to flatter. She bears him 2 daughters, securing her position even though neither is the male heir Spain desperately wants. And she prepares for the future, building relationships with key courtiers and ministers, positioning herself to seize power when Ferdinand inevitably dies. Her survival strategy is successful. She endures 4 years of marriage to Ferdinand, giving him what he wants in private while maintaining her dignity in public. She's neither crushed like Maria Josepha nor destroyed like Maria Isabel. She's a survivor, willing to pay whatever price is necessary to gain and keep power. When Ferdinand dies in 1833, Maria Cristina moves swiftly to secure the regency for her daughter Isabella. She purges the court of anyone too loyal to Ferdinand's memory, destroys much of the evidence of his private life, and begins the process of rewriting history to make the late king seem less monstrous than he was. Her motivations are complex. Partly she's protecting her daughter's legitimacy. It wouldn't do for Isabella to be seen as the daughter of a monster. Partly she's protecting herself. As Ferdinand's widow, his reputation affects hers. And partly, perhaps, she's protecting Spain itself. The country needs stability, not scandal. But the cost of this historical revision is truth. The suffering of Ferdinand's previous wives is minimized or forgotten. The abuses in the palace are denied or rationalized. The scope of Ferdinand's cruelty is reduced to mere difficult temperament or occasionally harsh discipline. The monster is transformed through careful propaganda into merely a flawed man. Your body shifts slightly in sleep, finding a new comfortable position without waking. The blankets settle around you, warm and secure. Your breathing remains deep and regular, your heartbeat slow and steady. The night continues, peaceful and quiet, as the story unfolds in dimensions you're no longer aware of. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, at the age of 48. Contemporary accounts describe his final illness as painful and prolonged, involving what was probably cancer of the stomach. He suffered for weeks, losing weight, unable to eat, racked with pain that even large doses of laudanum couldn't fully suppress. Some at court saw divine justice in his suffering. After inflicting so much pain on others, he was now experiencing pain himself, unable to escape or control it. But others, more cynical or more compassionate, simply saw a man dying badly. As many do, his suffering neither more nor less meaningful than anyone else's. In his final days, Ferdinand called for priests, confessed his sins, received the sacraments. What exactly he confessed, we don't know. The seal of confession means those secrets died with the priests who heard them. But we can imagine, if we choose to, those final private reckonings. A dying man forced to face what he'd done with the life he'd been given. Did he feel remorse? Did he understand at the end the suffering he'd caused? Or did he rationalize it all, convince himself that as king, he'd had the right to do whatever he wanted, that those who suffered under his rule deserved their fate or were simply unlucky? We'll never know what went through Ferdinand's mind in those final hours. Human consciousness remains private, especially at the moment of death. All we know is that he died. His grip on Spain finally loosened, and the country moved forward without him. But his legacy remained, tangible and poisonous. The Spain he left behind was poor, divided, repressive, and about to explode into civil war, the Carlist Wars. Fought between supporters of his daughter Isabella and his brother Carlos, would tear the country apart for years. Hundreds of thousands would die in a conflict rooted partly in Ferdinand's decision to change succession laws to favor his daughter. Beyond the immediate political chaos, Ferdinand left a legacy of damaged institutions and corrupted values. The restoration of absolutism hadn't just been about political structures. It had been about reimposing a worldview where hierarchy, obedience, and tradition mattered more than individual rights or human dignity. That worldview, forced on Spain for nearly 2 decades, wouldn't disappear just because the king was dead. Sleep surrounds you completely, holds you in its healing embrace. The night passes in its slow, majestic way, stars wheeling overhead, the moon crossing the sky. Dawn approaching but still hours away, your body rests, repairs, renews itself in ways both mysterious and essential. The story is just sound now, just vibration in air carrying no meaning, serving only as backdrop to the profound unconsciousness of deep sleep. Dr. Miguel Torres, in his 2009 book, The Long Shadow, Ferdinand VII and Modern Spain, argues that Ferdinand's reign had lasting effects on Spanish political culture that persisted well into the 20th century. Spain's difficulty in establishing stable democracy, its cycles of revolution and reaction, its tendency toward authoritarian solutions to political crises. All of this traces back, at least in part, to the Fernandine era, Torres contends. Ferdinand VII showed Spain what absolute power without moral restraint looks like. The experience was so traumatic that the country oscillated between trying to restore that power and trying to completely eliminate monarchy itself. The middle ground, constitutional monarchy with real but limited royal authority, remained elusive for generations. Other historians push back against this interpretation, arguing that blaming Spain's later problems on one king gives him too much credit and ignores larger structural issues. But even these critics acknowledge that Ferdinand's reign was a missed opportunity, a chance to modernize Spain that was deliberately squandered, imagine, they suggest. If Ferdinand had embraced constitutional monarchy in 1814, worked with liberals to reform Spanish institutions, recognized the independence of Latin American colonies, and established productive trading relationships, instead of wasting resources on futile military campaigns, Spain could have emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as a modern European power, ready to participate in the Industrial Revolution and the political reforms sweeping the continent. Instead, Ferdinand chose repression, revenge, and personal indulgence. Spain stagnated while other European nations advanced. The empire collapsed while other powers expanded their global influence. Opportunities were missed that would never come again. And in the private chambers of the royal palace, suffering occurred that served no purpose beyond Ferdinand's gratification. Lives were damaged or destroyed not for any political goal, not for any national interest, but simply because one man had power and used it cruelly. Your dreams have returned, floating up from the deepest levels of sleep, strange and symbolic and somehow emotionally resonant even when they make no logical sense. Images from your own life blend with images from the story, creating new narratives that have meaning only to your unconscious mind. A palace becomes a place you know. A historical figure becomes someone from your own experience. The past and present merge in ways that would be impossible in waking life, but that feel perfectly natural in dreams. 200 years after Ferdinand VII's death, we still don't have complete answers about his private life. Too much evidence was destroyed. Too many witnesses died without speaking. Too many secrets were buried with the bodies. What we have instead are fragments, suggestive but inconclusive documents, coded references in letters, second-hand accounts from people recalling events decades later, diplomatic reports that hint at scandals without detailing them. From these fragments, historians have tried to reconstruct the truth. But the picture remains frustratingly incomplete. Some historians argue that the mystery itself is significant. The fact that so much effort went into concealing Ferdinand's private life suggests there was something worth concealing. The systematic destruction of evidence, the careful silence of witnesses, the coded language in contemporary accounts, all of this implies behavior that contemporaries found deeply troubling. If Ferdinand had simply been an ordinary bad husband, harsh and unloving but not exceptionally so, there would have been no need for such elaborate concealment, argues Dr. Patricia Rivera, in her 2016 study, Hidden Histories, The Private Lives of Spanish Monarchs. The effort that went into suppressing information about Ferdinand's private life suggests behavior that went far beyond the norms even of an era when domestic abuse was common and rarely punished. But other historians caution against reading too much into gaps in the historical record. Lots of documents from this era were lost or destroyed for mundane reasons. Fires, wars, simple neglect. The absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of a cover-up. We have to be careful not to let lurid speculation fill gaps in our knowledge, writes Dr. James Richardson in his 2019 article, Evidentiary Standards and Historical Scandal. Yes, Ferdinand VII was probably a bad husband and likely engaged in sexual practices his contemporaries would have condemned. But the specific details matter, and claiming to know more than the evidence supports isn't history. It's fiction. This tension between what we can prove and what seems likely given the fragmentary evidence characterizes much of the historical debate about Ferdinand VII. Were his 4 marriages characterized by physical abuse? Almost certainly, based on the limited evidence we have. Did he engage in sexual practices considered deviant for his era? Probably, given contemporary references to his unusual appetites. Was he responsible for the deaths of any of his wives? Possibly, though proving it is impossible at this distance. Your sleep has grown lighter now, rising gradually toward the surface of consciousness. Soon you'll wake, but not yet, not for a while still. The deep restoration is mostly complete, but your body and mind need this lighter sleep too. This space where dreams and semi-conscious processing occur. The story continues, and in this lighter sleep, you're vaguely aware of it again, processing it not as narrative but as emotional tone, as atmosphere. The question of how to remember Ferdinand VII remains contested. Spanish history textbooks have struggled with this, trying to present a balanced view that acknowledges his political failures without dwelling on private scandals that remain partly speculative. Most modern accounts present him as a reactionary king who missed Spain's chance at modernization, a ruler who chose absolutism when the era of absolute monarchy was ending, a man whose stubbornness and cruelty damaged his country. His private life is mentioned briefly, if at all, usually in vague terms about difficult marriages or controversial personal behavior. This approach satisfies no one. Historians who focus on gender and power dynamics argue that erasing or minimizing the suffering of Ferdinand's wives represents another form of violence, a historical silencing that parallels the contemporary silence that allowed abuse to continue. They contend that Ferdinand's treatment of women was inseparable from his political cruelty, that both stemmed from the same inability to see other people as fully human. When we talk about Ferdinand VII without discussing what happened to his wives, we're implicitly accepting the values of his era, where women's suffering didn't matter as much as men's political achievements or failures, argues Dr. Carmen Lopez. We're saying that state policy is historically important, but domestic violence isn't. And that sends a message, whether we intend it or not. But other historians counter that focusing on unverifiable private scandals risks trivializing the serious political history of the period. Ferdinand's reign marked the failure of Spanish absolutism, the loss of Spain's American empire, the beginning of decades of civil conflict. These are historically significant events that affected millions of people. Focusing instead on what one man did to 4 women, however deplorable, risks missing the larger story. History isn't about satisfying modern sensibilities about gender politics, argues Dr. Antonio Rodriguez. It's about understanding what happened and why it matters. Ferdinand VII matters because of his political impact, not because of his sex life. This debate reflects larger questions about what history is for, what stories deserve to be told, how we balance the personal and the political, the private and the public. There are no easy answers, only ongoing conversations that reflect our current concerns as much as they illuminate the past. The gray light of approaching dawn begins to seep through your curtains. Though your eyes remain closed, your body still relaxed in sleep. The night is ending, but gently, gradually, allowing you to complete the sleep cycle naturally before waking. The story is nearly finished, winding down as the night winds down, preparing to release you back into consciousness. What, if anything, can we learn from the disturbing story of Ferdinand VII? The temptation is to dismiss him as a monster from a different era, someone so removed from our modern context that his story carries no contemporary relevance. But that would be a mistake. Absolute power still exists in the modern world, perhaps not in the form of hereditary monarchy, but in authoritarian regimes, corrupt institutions, and systems that concentrate power in the hands of individuals who exercise it without effective oversight or accountability. And when such power is concentrated, abuse follows with predictable regularity. The specifics change, the cultural context evolves, but the basic dynamic remains. Give someone unchecked power over others. Remove all consequences for misconduct, and cruelty emerges. Ferdinand VII's story reminds us why systems of accountability matter, why no individual should have absolute power, why institutional checks and balances aren't just bureaucratic niceties, but essential protections against human weakness and cruelty. It also reminds us about the importance of bearing witness, of documenting abuse even when it's dangerous to do so, of preserving evidence even when powerful interests want it destroyed. The fragmentary records that survived of Ferdinand's reign, preserved by brave or rebellious individuals at personal risk, are all we have to reconstruct what happened. Without them, the truth would be entirely lost.
Replaced by official propaganda, Dr. Elena Martinez writes, "Every document that survived Ferdinand's attempts to control his narrative
Every letter that escaped destruction. Every diary entry that was hidden rather than burned. These represent small acts of resistance. The servant who wrote down what he witnessed. The diplomat who reported truthfully to his government. The family member who preserved letters rather than destroying them. They were all saying in their own way, "This matters." This shouldn't be forgotten, even if acknowledging it is dangerous. Your body stirs slightly, unconsciously adjusting position as you begin the final drift toward waking. Your breathing changes subtly, becomes slightly less deep, slightly more regular. Your eyelids flutter, though they don't yet open. The transition from sleep to wakefulness has begun, a gradual process that will take several more minutes to complete. The story of Ferdinand's wives also reminds us about the particular vulnerability of women in patriarchal systems, where marriage can become a trap from which there is no escape. Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, and Maria Josepha couldn't leave their abusive husband, couldn't speak publicly about their suffering, couldn't even confide fully in their families without risking interception and retaliation. They were queens, living in luxury, with servants attending to their every need, but they were also prisoners, trapped by law and custom and lack of alternatives in relationships that damaged or destroyed them. Their stories echo in modern domestic abuse situations, where wealth or status or social pressure keeps victims trapped in dangerous relationships. When we study historical abuse, we often focus on the powerless, on slaves or servants or peasants, notes Dr. Sarah Thompson. Ferdinand's wives remind us that even relatively privileged women could be trapped by gender hierarchies that gave their husbands nearly absolute power over them. Status didn't protect them. Wealth didn't save them. Royal birth didn't matter. What mattered was that they were women married to a man who could do as he pleased. The story also raises questions about collective responsibility and bystander behavior. Everyone at Ferdinand's court knew something was wrong. The servants saw evidence of abuse. The courtiers heard the rumors. The ministers understood that the king's private behavior was problematic. And yet, with rare exceptions, no one spoke up, no one intervened. No one risked their position or safety to protect the victims. It's easy, from our modern perspective, to judge this silence harshly, but how different are we really? Modern institutions still harbor abusers whose behavior is whispered about, but not officially addressed. Modern workplaces still have toxic leaders whose cruelty everyone knows about, but no one challenges. Modern communities still protect powerful individuals at the expense of their victims. The dynamics that allowed Ferdinand VII's abuse to continue unchallenged haven't disappeared, argues Dr. James Crawford. They've just evolved. We still struggle with the same basic questions. When is it worth risking our own security to protect someone else? How much do we tolerate from powerful individuals because challenging them seems too difficult or dangerous? At what point does silence become complicity? These aren't easy questions, and the story of Ferdinand VII doesn't provide easy answers. It simply reminds us that the questions matter, that how we respond to abuse of power has real consequences, that choosing silence isn't neutral but rather a form of enabling. The first birds begin their morning songs outside your window. Tentative at first, then building in volume and complexity. Your unconscious mind registers the sound, begins the process of bringing you back to full wakefulness. Your eyelids flutter more insistently, your breathing deepens, then evens out. Soon, very soon, you'll wake fully, refreshed by a night of deep sleep, ready to face the new day. As we reach the end of this long night's journey through one of history's darker chapters, what remains to be said about Ferdinand VII? He was a king who ruled Spain for 19 years during one of its most turbulent periods. He presided over the loss of Spain's American empire, the restoration and collapse of absolutism, the beginning of the Carlist Wars that would divide the country for decades. His political legacy is almost entirely negative, a catalogue of missed opportunities and deliberate cruelties. But beyond the political history lies the personal tragedy of the people who suffered under his direct power. 4 wives who endured what we can only partly imagine, servants who faced his unpredictable rages, courtiers who learned to navigate his dangerous moods, subjects who lived under his repressive regime. Their suffering wasn't necessary for any grand historical purpose. It didn't serve Spain's interests or advance any noble cause. It occurred simply because one damaged man had absolute power and used it to gratify his darkest impulses. Dr. Patricia Rivera writes, In the end, what makes Ferdinand VII's story so disturbing isn't that he was uniquely evil. History has produced far more destructive tyrants, far crueler rulers. What makes his story disturbing is how ordinary he was in most respects. How easily we can trace the path from damaged child to damaged adult to destructive ruler. He's disturbing because we can understand him, can see how the combination of psychological damage and absolute power produced the monster he became. And that understanding is uncomfortable because it suggests that given the wrong circumstances, the wrong upbringing, the wrong combination of trauma and power, many people might follow similar paths. The capacity for cruelty isn't unique to historical villains. It lives in all of us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Your eyes open slowly, adjusting to the dim pre-dawn light filtering through your curtains. Your body feels heavy, relaxed. Not quite ready to move yet. You've slept deeply and well. The story serving its purpose of guiding you through the night toward morning. The historical horrors remain safely in the past, unable to touch you, relevant only as lessons and warnings. Ferdinand VII died nearly 2 centuries ago. His wives are long since dust. The palace servants who suffered under his rule have been dead for generations. The courtiers who enabled his behavior are forgotten. Even the buildings where these events occurred have been renovated, redecorated, repurposed, until no physical trace of that era remains. And yet, the story persists, passed down through fragmentary records and historical accounts, whispered about in academic circles, occasionally surfacing in popular history books and documentaries. Why does it persist? What purpose does remembering serve? Perhaps it persists because the dynamics it illustrates haven't disappeared. Power still corrupts, damaged people still damage others. Systems still protect abusers at the expense of victims. Bystanders still struggle with when and how to intervene. The specifics change, but the patterns recur. Or perhaps it persists simply because we're drawn to understanding human darkness, trying to comprehend how people can do terrible things, seeking to make sense of behavior that defies easy explanation. Ferdinand VII's story offers no comfort, provides no happy ending, suggests no simple solutions, but it does offer understanding, incomplete and unsettling though it may be. You stretch slowly, carefully, enjoying the pleasant ache of muscles that have been still for hours. Your mind is clear, rested, ready for the day ahead. The story that carried you through the night fades quickly, becoming just another memory among thousands. Important for what it accomplished, rather than for its content. Outside your window, dawn arrives fully. The sky lightens from gray to pale blue. The bird's morning chorus reaches its peak, somewhere nearby. You hear the sounds of the world waking, a car starting, a dog barking, footsteps on pavement. Normal. Everyday sounds that ground you firmly in the present, far removed from Spanish palaces and dead kings. Ferdinand VII ruled Spain from 1814 to 1833, a period that now seems impossibly distant. The world he knew has vanished completely, replaced by technologies and social structures he couldn't have imagined. The absolute power he wielded has been broken up, distributed, constrained by laws and institutions. The kind of abuse he inflicted would be less easy to conceal in an age of cameras and instant communication. And yet human nature remains recognizably human. We still struggle with power and its abuse, with cruelty and complicity. With speaking truth when silence seems safer, history doesn't repeat itself exactly. But it rhymes, offering variations on familiar themes. As you rise from bed, leaving behind the warm cocoon of blankets, preparing to face whatever this new day brings, the story of Ferdinand VII settles into its proper place. History, important but not immediately relevant, disturbing but not personally threatening, educational without being prescriptive. You've spent a night with history's monsters and emerged unscathed, carried safely through the darkness by the rhythm of narrative. The comfort of knowing these events are long past, the security of your own comfortable bed and locked doors and modern world. The story ends where all history stories must, in the present moment, with you, fully awake now, standing in the safety of your own time and place. Ferdinand VII's cruelties, his wives' suffering, the complicity of his court, all of it is sealed in the past. Transformed into lessons rather than lived experiences, you move through your morning routine, the story already fading from immediate consciousness. becoming background knowledge rather than active thought, and that's as it should be.
History serves us best when it informs without overwhelming.
When it teaches without traumatizing, the Spanish royal palace still stands in Madrid. A major tourist attraction now, visitors walk through gilded halls. Admire priceless art, photograph ornate throne rooms. The tour guides mention Ferdinand VII briefly, usually focusing on political events rather than personal scandals. Most tourists leave knowing he was a controversial king during a turbulent period. Very few learn the darker truths we've explored tonight. Dr. Elena Martinez, reflecting on her decade studying Ferdinand VII, writes, "Sometimes I wonder if we should talk about these things at all. The evidence is fragmentary, the victims are long dead. The suffering can't be undone or avenged. What purpose does dragging it all back into the light serve? But then I remember that silence is what allowed it to happen in the first place. Silence is what protected Ferdinand from accountability. Silence is what erased his victims from history, leaving them as footnotes if they're mentioned at all. Speaking the truth, even an incomplete and disturbing truth, even centuries after the fact, that matters. It says that suffering matters, that cruelty matters. That power must be accountable, even if that accountability comes only from history's judgment." The morning continues its steady progression toward full day. Sunlight streams through windows, warming rooms, chasing away the last shadows of night. The world turns, indifferent to human stories, continuing its ancient patterns regardless of what happens in palaces or peasant huts, in marble halls or forgotten graves. But perhaps the most important thing to understand about Ferdinand VII's story is that it isn't really finished. Not because new evidence might emerge, though that's possible, but because the questions it raises remain unanswered in our own time. What do we owe victims whose suffering occurred long ago? How do we balance historical truth against the impossibility of complete knowledge? When does speculation cross the line into irresponsible sensationalism? How do we talk about sexual violence and abuse in historical contexts without either minimizing it or exploiting it? These questions matter beyond academic circles. They inform how we handle abuse allegations in contemporary settings, how we balance believing victims against demands for proof, how we navigate the complex territory between protecting the vulnerable and respecting due process. Ferdinand VII's story offers no template for solving these dilemmas. It simply illustrates how old they are, how persistent, how resistant to easy answers. The dynamics of power and abuse, of complicity and resistance, of speaking and silence. These haven't fundamentally changed in 200 years. We've developed better legal frameworks, stronger institutional protections, more robust human rights norms. But the basic human elements remain recognizable. The day is fully established now, the night completely past. You're engaged with the present, breakfast, work, obligations, the thousand small tasks and decisions that fill ordinary days. The story of a long-dead Spanish king has served its purpose, guided you through darkness toward morning, filled the empty hours with narrative that held your attention without demanding too much engagement. In Spanish history, Ferdinand VII is typically listed among the worst monarchs, a cautionary tale about absolutism's failures and the dangers of concentrating power without accountability. Students learn about his political repression, his loss of the American colonies, his role in triggering the Carlist Wars. Most never learn about what happened in his private apartments, about 4 wives who suffered in ways we can only partly reconstruct. Is this omission a failure of historical education or a reasonable editorial decision? Should every history student learn about royal abuse, or is focusing on political and economic history a legitimate choice about what matters most? There's no consensus answer, only ongoing debate. What's certain is that the story matters to some people, for reasons both intellectual and personal. Survivors of abuse sometimes find strange comfort in knowing that even queens and princesses weren't safe. That vulnerability to intimate partner violence transcends class and era. Historians interested in gender and power find in Ferdinand's reign a particularly clear example of how patriarchal systems enabled abuse. Those studying the psychology of tyranny see in his damaged childhood and cruel adulthood a pattern repeated across history. And others like you encounter the story as you drift towards sleep, finding in its dark narrative something that paradoxically soothes rather than disturbs, perhaps because historical horror is contained, safely distant, unable to reach across the centuries to cause harm in the present. Your day continues its natural progression, the morning routine completed, You move into whatever this day holds. The story recedes further, becoming just one more piece of information stored somewhere in memory, available for recall but not actively present in consciousness. In Madrid, tourists are already lining up outside the royal palace. Cameras ready, guidebooks open. They'll walk through rooms where Ferdinand once held court, see portraits of him and his wives, learn carefully curated versions of history designed to inform without disturbing. Some will ask guides questions about his personal life. Most guides will deflect, focusing on architecture and art rather than scandal. In archives across Spain and Europe, folders containing letters, diplomatic reports, court documents sit quietly on shelves, waiting for researchers who may never come. Some of these documents have never been fully analyzed, never been incorporated into the historical narrative. They wait, patient as all documents must, for scholars with time and interest and access to bring their contents back into active historical consciousness. In universities, occasionally a graduate student will choose Ferdinand VII as a dissertation topic, spending years immersed in his reign, struggling to separate documented fact from probable speculation from wishful interpretation. Some of these dissertations will contribute genuinely new insights, others will rehash familiar debates. All of them will grapple with the fundamental challenge: how to understand a man who died 2 centuries ago, leaving behind fragmentary evidence of behavior his contemporaries worked hard to conceal. The sun climbs higher, shadows shorten, the morning moves toward midday. The natural world continues its cycles, indifferent to human concerns, operating according to laws that predate civilization and will outlast it. This indifference is somehow comforting, a reminder that individual human stories, however dramatic or disturbing, occur within contexts vastly larger than themselves. So what remains? At the end of this long exploration of Ferdinand VII's dark legacy, a few documented facts, many reasonable inferences, some uncomfortable questions, and the lingering sense that we've touched something important, even if we can't quite define what it is. Ferdinand VII was born in 1784 and died in 1833. He ruled Spain as absolute monarch for 19 of those years. He married 4 times. 3 of his wives died young. The 4th survived him. His political legacy was largely negative. His personal legacy remains partially hidden, deliberately obscured by those who found the truth too disturbing to preserve. These are facts, verifiable through multiple sources. Everything else, the specific nature of his cruelties, the exact suffering of his wives, the details of what happened behind closed palace doors, exists in the murky territory between documentation and speculation, between what we can prove and what seems likely given fragmentary evidence. History requires us to operate in this uncertain space, making our best judgments based on incomplete information, acknowledging what we don't know while still trying to understand what we can. It's uncomfortable work, especially when dealing with sensitive topics like abuse and violence. The temptation is always to either claim more certainty than the evidence supports, or to retreat into agnosticism that amounts to erasure. The challenge is finding the middle path, speaking about what likely happened while acknowledging uncertainty, taking victims' suffering seriously while respecting evidentiary standards, understanding individual psychology without excusing cruel behavior, recognizing historical context without using it to minimize harm. Ferdinand VII's story doesn't make this easier. If anything, it highlights how difficult these judgments are. How reasonable historians can examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions. How the passage of time both clarifies and obscures, revealing patterns while hiding specifics. But perhaps that's appropriate. History isn't supposed to be comfortable or conclusive. It's supposed to challenge us, to make us think, to force us to grapple with complexity and ambiguity and the fundamental difficulty of understanding human behavior across vast distances of time and culture. Your day has found its rhythm now, whatever shape that takes for you, work or leisure, solitude or company, productivity or rest. The story that filled the night hours has completed its purpose, served its function, earned its place in the vast archive of historical narratives that humans tell each other about their past. In that sense, Ferdinand VII lives on, not as he perhaps wished, as a glorious monarch whose name would be honored through the ages, but as a cautionary tale, a negative example, a reminder of what absolute power without moral constraint produces. Not the legacy he would have chosen, but perhaps the legacy he earned. The wives, too, live on, though even more dimly. their individual personalities largely lost to history, reduced to roles in someone else's story. Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, Maria Josefa, Maria Cristina, 4 women who married a king and paid different prices for that choice. Their suffering, imperfectly documented and incompletely understood, nevertheless reminds us that history isn't just about great men and political events. It's also about ordinary people, or in this case, privileged but still vulnerable people, caught in circumstances beyond their control. Trying to survive as best they can, we honor them, perhaps, by remembering that they existed, by acknowledging their suffering even when we can't fully document it, by refusing to let historical silence erase their experiences as contemporary silence enabled their abuse. It's imperfect memorial, but it's what history can offer. Recognition, acknowledgement, the small dignity of being remembered. The day continues toward evening. The cycle of light and darkness preparing to repeat. Tonight you'll sleep again. Perhaps to another story, or perhaps to simple silence. The story of Ferdinand VII will remain available, archived in documents and books and digital files, waiting for the next person who seeks to understand this particular chapter of human darkness. And that finally is history's purpose, not to judge, though judgment sometimes emerges naturally from understanding, not to punish, the guilty are beyond reach, not even necessarily to prevent similar horrors in the future, though we hope for that effect. History's purpose is simply to remember, to bear witness, to say, this happened. These people lived and suffered and died, and they mattered enough to remember. Ferdinand VII died in 1833. His wives died before him or shortly after. His court is dust. His palace is a museum. His empire is divided into independent nations. His power is gone, transformed into the limited power that historical figures have, to inform, to educate, to warn, to illustrate. And with that, as full day arrives and you move through the hours that stretch between now and sleep, the story reaches its natural end. Not because everything has been explained, much remains mysterious, but because everything that can usefully be said has been said. The rest is silence, the silence of the grave that claims all stories eventually. The silence that history works to break even knowing the effort is always incomplete. You're fully present now, in your own time, your own place, your own life. The Spanish palace exists only in history books and tourist photos. Ferdinand VII exists only in documents and academic debates. The suffering of his victims exists only in our acknowledgement that it occurred, our recognition that it mattered. And that acknowledgement, that recognition, carries us forward into our own time, our own struggles with power and abuse, with speaking and silence, with remembering and forgetting. The specifics change, the patterns persist. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, offering endless variations on familiar human themes. The story is finished, the night has passed. The day awaits, and history, patient and persistent, continues its work of preserving, questioning, interpreting the vast archive of human experience, one fragmented story at a time. Rest well, knowing that even the darkest stories end eventually, that even the worst tyrants die, that time eventually transforms horror into history, immediate danger into distant warning. The monsters of the past can't hurt us, except through the lessons we choose to ignore. Ferdinand VII's story is over. Yours continues, make of that what you will.